Hello and welcome to the What the Finance podcast, where we talk to experts about all things finance. If you get value out of this episode, please subscribe so you don't miss out on any in the future. I hope you enjoy.
Eric, thank you so much for joining the podcast today, the What the Finance podcast, to talk with us. So my first question: we've seen massive government action over the past year, which in the US could soon culminate in both an infrastructure bill, over $1 trillion, and potentially a 3.5 trillion deficit. Is there any way of winding these numbers down over the next few years, do you think, without sort of greater risk to the economy?
Well, first off, Anthony, thank you for having me on your show. Big fan. I do think when we talk about winding down, that's the key word. Over in the U.S., we call it tapering, and tapering is really two functions. The first part of tapering really has to do with how does the Fed drop down its book? Right now the Fed's sitting on about $7.7 trillion on its balance sheet, which if you start unwinding that, I think there's some liquidity concerns in the market. And whenever we talk about liquidity concerns, that's usually a short-run issue. Could that? I think one of the theories floating around in economics and finance right now is as we taper down the federal sheet, are we going to see, and we see the spending arise, especially this infrastructure bill, $3.5 trillion deficit? Are these factors going to help alleviate some of those tapering pains? And is it being intentionally done to relieve these tapering pains for some of the largest Fed sheet of all time? My personal opinion on, I think opinion of a lot of more active people in finance and economics right now, is I think the federal government and the Federal Reserve will do what's needed to be done without having a massive supply shock. I just don't. I think after getting through the worst global economic situation to ever hit us, or at least on record. I think they're unwilling to just be like, oh, well, we did this. Well, let's let the market just recorrect itself. Like anything in economics wins. It's undefeated. It wins 100 out of 100 times in the long run. But I think all these plans, infrastructure, ARPA, the CARES Act, I think what these are all doing right now is expanding the production of the United States greater than what it would be in the long run. I think that's true for European nations. I think that's true for all nations that engaged in dramatic economic stimulus. In economics, we have this thing called the production frontier, which is basically the max production an economy can have, but for some stimulus. And we are the biggest but for some stimulus that there's ever been, probably since World War II, to be honest. But I think what we'll see is a gradual, less dramatic than, say, a post-war economy that occurs in a post-war economy. I do think we'll see tapering. I do think we'll see a reduction in spending. But I think that reduction in spending is going to be coming in the reduction of deficits, not a swing from, hey, $3.5 trillion deficit to let's try and get $1 trillion surplus. So more graduated. I'm a little more optimistic on it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you mentioned something there that at the moment, we've seen lots of pain in sort of 2008, and it was long-term pain. But at the moment, it's just gotten to the point where, both politics on both sides, they just don't want to see that pain because they understand the impact they may have on them being reelected potentially as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think you can look at some of the elections that we're seeing from more developed countries just in the last, since mid 2020, we're seeing that exactly what you just said is what we're seeing. So nobody wants to feel the pain, and if you have the ability to bond, then you probably aren't going to willingly take that.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess that they've probably seen in Greece and other southern European countries, austerity doesn't always work, does it? And that's been a massive thing. Yeah, definitely. So one thing you mentioned there as well was obviously that it's a little bit similar to sort of post World War II. It's actually one of my questions. Do you think we're going to be entering a similar cycle to that? Or if not, sort of what would the differences be?
Yeah, it's one of the hardest things about the pandemic from an economic and finance standpoint. I'm sure a lot of your listeners, I'm not telling anything they don't know, is there's no data. There's no data. You gave the best example, which is post World War II. And post World War II was really weird. And part of that was part of the reason for that was the United States became an industrial hub because of all the damage done in Europe. And it was pre-industrialization of China and Indochina. And Japan was still a couple decades away from the technology powerhouse it would eventually become. So the U.S. was the only source, and it's hard to say if it could have been done better, if it should have been done better, but there was no other competition. There was no other industrialized area that wasn't severely bombed or severely damaged or had massive reduction in manpower. It's important to note that the U.S. lost 425,000 troops in World War II. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people. Obviously, we all know the statistics involved in Europe between every demographic. I mean, talking 20 to 30 million. Some estimates say 60 million people died during World War II. 425,000 were in the United States for a country that fought on all sides. And then afterwards, the United States was completely had no damage. Its industrial sector was better than it was at the beginning of the war. And it ushered in a new age of fast travel, assembly line manufacturing, airplanes. Those technological advancements are huge for economic development, huge for financial gains. And the question becomes, in this post-COVID world, in this post-recovery world, what is going to be that technological advancement that spurs economic growth? After World War II, it was highways, it was cars, it was the assembly line, it was air travel. Think how expensive air travel is now. Your Boeing 747 selling for $355 million. I personally believe that what we're going to see, that technological jump afterwards, and the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economics was actually given out for a team of economists who brilliantly figured out these benefits in the long run of these technological advancements. I think it's going to be in medicine, and I don't think I'm surprising anybody. I hope you didn't fall out of your chair there, Anthony. But I want to make a metaphor, or I want to make an example of pre-World War II. Pre-World War II, I like to look at airplanes. I think airplanes are just fascinating technology. We went from in the United States in the mid-1930s to airplanes that could carry a few thousand-pound bombs and fly 1,000 miles, to B-29s that can carry 20,000 pounds of fuel and bombs and travel 6,000 miles in the span of 12 years, from 1933 to 1945. And the B-29 was obsolete after 3 years, replaced by the B-36 Peacemaker. On a much more, I think, less grisly example, in the years before COVID, we had the Ebola outbreak, and we got to see the effect of these mRNA vaccines that are just incredible. And then you started seeing CRISPR, and before CRISPR, CAR-T, and you see all these massive advancements on how we understand our immune system to be able to, attack anything that can harm us. And now you see all this money flood into healthcare. I mean, just insane amounts of money. And just like insane amounts of money were flooded into the aviation industry in World War II, and you enter World War II with prop planes with big radial piston engines, and you leave with jet engines. I think that's what we're going to see. I think we're going to have the prop-driven, unfortunate for, cancer treatment, chemotherapy, and radiation. I think on the other end of this, you're going to see the mRNA treatments. You're going to see you're going to see CAR-T, which existed before, but didn't get any amount of funding necessary from a federal standpoint. You're going to see it just rapidly evolve. And, as much as I love airplanes, I think I'd take the medical advancements over the airplanes. I hate to say that.
Yeah, definitely. And you never know, we might see sort of a rocket war between Musk and Bezos.
That'd be interesting to watch. Not enough money to participate, but it'd be a good show.
Yeah, definitely. But I think one thing you mentioned, obviously healthcare, but then, we've seen the demographics of a lot of the Western countries and more wealthy, even China, and Japan, they're just becoming older and older and older. And it's going to get to the point where, you don't want to say burden, but it is going to cost a lot more for these people to be looked after. So I guess this investment is vital for not just for the investment, but obviously for helping the elderly population as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think we're getting the theory of like triple M, like modern monetization theory is, we do the best example we have is Japan, where there's 300% debt to GDP ratio. They have a very old aging population. I think about 35% of the population is going to be over the age of 70 in the next 2 decades. Very low birth rate. Russia is actually going through a similar thing right now. They have a low birth rate too. And it's not exclusive to the just Western developed world. I think it's all developed countries eventually do this. In developmental economics, we have this kind of funny phrase, which is children are consumed, not produced. It's the first time you hear that, you're like, what are we doing here? I thought we were doing some calculus. What's this? And what that basically means is that as it becomes more expensive to raise children, you produce less children. So because of that, in traditional market equilibrium economics, children are based upon how much money you make. So you say it's a consumption side of the equation. And as we see in society become more and more expensive to have children, I think you see Japan's kind of a few decades ahead of us, maybe more traditional Western nations, with the drop in birth rate. And Japan's also an incredibly difficult country to immigrate to. And this isn't me talking bad about Japan. I think it's an example the rest of the world's going to see that happening and say, all right, we need to do stuff to make having children easier. The U.S. the family tax credit, child tax credit. I think expanded maternity leave is something you're going to see every country adopt, and even more than what some countries adopt now. And I also think you're going to see a reduction in the frictional cost to immigrate to countries. Right now in the United States, the average person immigrating is costing about $15,000, which means it's several years worth of the average income for a lot of places these people are immigrating from. So I think you're going to see that cost come down. I'm a believer that eventually you'll probably see Ellis Island style immigration come back, where it's less about this very long bureaucratic process and more about having the people power getting across the border. So I think as we look towards you're going to have these health advantages in society aging, it will increase the demand for better maternity benefits and better immigration policy.
Yeah, definitely. I think I saw something recently where the UK, most of the growth that I've seen over the past 20 years has mainly been linked to immigration. A lot of these people coming into the economy obviously growing. So it actually hasn't grown proportionally more than it has. It's all about immigration.
Yeah. I'm definitely more of an Austrian in my viewpoints, but my favorite economist of all time is Dr. Arthur Lewis. He wrote the famous Lewis model, which basically says if you stop immigrating, you stop growing as an economy. And beautifully simple. I believe it. I'm a pro-immigration person.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that you did mention there is obviously Japan. It's high, very high debt to GDP rate. But another issue they've seen as well is deflation. So, and they've really struggled with inflation, and that's what I think that's what a lot of the time they think, if you grow, you can deflate away the debt, but they haven't been able to do that. So, do you think that could be a risk for the US as well, especially let's say if you get to the point where it's almost like stagflation, where you're not growing, and do you think that could be a massive risk?
Anthony, you hit the $1 million word, stagflation. That is absolutely a threat. I have a very different view, and I think it's probably because I'm more of an econ person. I am a finance. I'm an economist who does finance, and that's the whole mechanism for debt is very interesting with the United States, because we borrow the money in our dollars, which is it's a very weird system where it's the U.S. printing money to borrow from itself. Like for example, if Germany wanted to borrow money from China, it would go yuan to dollar, dollar to euro. And that's very weird. We're the medium of exchange, and that's really what currency is, medium of exchange. So I am worried about inflation, but what I'm worried about inflation isn't actually in just regular everyday dollars losing value. Dollars lose value over time. It's a fact of life. It's a fiat currency. The U.S. doesn't practice the concept of seigniorage, and seigniorage is when you print money to pay your bills. Again, I'm probably a lot of your listeners are gonna be like, yes, Eric, we're very well aware of what seigniorage is. But again, part of our field is that we can't help to explain every weird word some economist made up 75 years ago. The U.S. doesn't do that. In order for the U.S. to spend a deficit, it has to borrow the money, and that's why in the U.S. we always have the argument about raising the debt limit. And a lot of countries don't have that argument. They just borrow more money, that creates hyperinflation. That's where you see Venezuela, Zimbabwe. You see that hyperinflation. What I'm worried about happening is a little bit of what I talked about before, which is the U.S. has its long-run aggregate supply, and it's at like, it looks like a curve about this, like this, and we produce somewhere out here. We're producing out here because there's so much government stimulus, and it's pushing that production. Well, guess what? The U.S. economy is growing, grows very stably. Large economies do grow very stably, and it's going to take a couple of years to catch up to where that stimulation was. Well, that production's already occurred, right? It's already there. It's already dollars in the pocket. Stimulus is already out. CARES Act is already out. So as the long-run aggregate production hits that point, until we hit that production point and start going past it and having new production that wasn't spurred by government stimulus, that whole time in between is basically inflation, right? The production's already done, and you're just looking at the amount of dollars having to be realized to meet that point, which I think is by the very definition stagflation. Prices are rising, real production is not. That's stagflation. That's my concern. I'm happy you brought that up, because I feel like it's a nuance getting missed in a lot of these discussions, is that people just talk about inflation. It's like, well, inflation is not a bad thing. Inflation can be a very good thing. But when inflation is getting baked into your stock market prices, it's getting baked into your home value, which stagflation, it doesn't get baked into those things. Well, then you're on the receiving end of just price increase. It's miserable. Yes, I do think that's a valid. I do think some tapering actions could help that. I do think new technological advancements could weaken that effect, but I think it's a very real threat to the economy.
Yeah, definitely. I guess that's where we could see maybe automation and these other things where that could drastically increase sort of the supply of all products, basically, and then that's where you might see the growth.
Yeah. Robots don't, as far as I know, robots don't seem to have some like off-hour demands. Like they're not going to like Chili's and something and trying to buy a nacho platter or something.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's crazy to think, and it's probably not that, like, I think we've seen the Tesla recently release that, so that what they want to do with their robots, so it's probably not that far away.
Yeah, and I think that's it's the next big technological advancement that we're going to see is this the automation of kind of all low to middle skill tasks. That whenever people, obviously you get people worried about automation. I always ask this question. You know, the first ATM was introduced in 1981. How has that affected tellers? There's twice as many tellers in the United States as there was in 1981. A lot of the technology is usually just a good thing. Very rarely. I mean, we really haven't had a time when technology has been purely solely bad. We really haven't.
Yeah, definitely. I guess you'd say as well that there'd be, millions and millions more technicians having to look after these machines as well. That would probably be where that comes from. Yeah. One thing you mentioned there was obviously, the stimulus, and have we seen one thing I've heard someone mention is quite interesting. It's like almost like adrenaline. So you pump the adrenaline into the economy and it reacts. But like anything, you could say caffeine as well. The more you use it, the less effective it is on yourself. So have we seen that recently, that they're just increasing the amount of money and it's becoming less and less effective on the actual economy and the growth that we're seeing?
Oh, I'm a big believer in that. And that adrenaline analogy is absolutely perfect. That's the acceleration to be on the production frontier. If you take a shot of adrenaline, you got to burn your fat stores. You got to burn the carbohydrates in your body. You don't get new carbohydrates just because you burnt them earlier. What do they often talk about? Adrenaline fatigue, like how you fall asleep after you get adrenaline rush. I think that's what we're all scared of. We're scared of the economy falling asleep after that shot. It's going to become less effective over time. There isn't a lot of good macroeconomic studies that show that long-run sustained stimulus is viable. You can save somebody's heart by giving them a shot of adrenaline, but you can also stop it with too much adrenaline. So I think it's that fine balance. I look at some of the macro guys, especially the financial economists who are on the macro side. I think they kind of have the hardest job of anybody in the econ discipline right now, because they're getting asked by policymakers to tell me when it's too much adrenaline. The answer is, well, if we didn't have to give adrenaline at all, it would be the perfect amount. It's not they're trying to. So it's almost like we have to. You brought up a good point. I think it was in your first question. The weaning off of the adrenaline. All right. It's going to be hard to know how much to wean off and how quickly. I think one of the things that's good in the United States right now is we just had a new presidential election, so it's we're not going to have another election soon, and obviously I stay away from politics, I do think when you see constant calls for re-elections and new governments getting formed, like you see in Europe a lot, I think that instability just adds another difficult variable to gauging the amount of adrenaline and the amount of economic medicine that we can give out. And I do still believe the U.S. is sets the tone for the global economy. So kind of makes me a little more a little more optimistic that it can be administered, the wean off can be administered better. It will be interesting to see this infrastructure package that's coming out, how much of it is infrastructure and how much of it is stimulus. There's a blurred line right there.
Yeah, I don't know if you can help me with that, because I think I looked and it was like 520 billion. I can see that's infrastructure, but I can't find what the other almost more than half, 600 billion. Do we know what it is, or?
Yeah. So it's what do we in the United States, the city I work for, we do a lot of bonding. Nothing compared to the U.S., but we all have to follow the same rules and regulations. And sometimes what this infrastructure package is, it's green infrastructure, it's gray infrastructure, it's a lot of really good infrastructure. It really is. I think this bill is actually really good. I think it's a good bipartisan bill. But the other half of it is mostly something we call social infrastructure. And social infrastructure is it's a nomenclature. It's colloquial. It's not the same as green and gray infrastructure. It can be enhanced social programs. It can be addressing food deserts, which are a big concern in the United States, especially in the southwest and southeast of the United States. There's a lot less solid economic understanding of social infrastructure. We really don't know how it should be spent, what's the most optimized points. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. That just means it's not the same as we know good roads are good for the economy. We know, green infrastructure will lower future costs to do more green infrastructure. Very well understood. The social infrastructure, which makes up almost half the bill, I think there's still the jury's still out on what's the best way to implement it and how it should be implemented. But that's the other half of the bill, and it's certainly a little controversial on what it should be used for. But it is from a purely quant guy, I look at it and go, oh, we're gonna get some good studies on that. We're gonna get some answers.
Yeah, it's definitely unheard of. But I guess most of what we've seen over the past year is we've never seen before. So as you said, it's almost like it's a bit scary. It's like social experiments, but a lot of the parts it has to happen, I think.
Yeah. In economics, we have this workhorse model. It's called difference in difference modeling, and it's just like two groups have the same thing at the beginning. One gets a treatment, one doesn't, and we see how they're different. And this is like, economic modeling galore. You're gonna be able to test everything, everything in the world. It's bad. It's bad that this is how it had to happen, but at least you can get some really solid research for hopefully a pandemic in 150 years that you and I won't be around to deal with again.
Yeah, definitely. I guess we're literally setting the way, aren't we? Yeah. So one thing you mentioned before was inflation, and I think the one word I've heard the most, I think the last few months, is transitory inflation. I think during COVID we'd have all these random words that have just popped up, and we've heard them more in the last year than we've ever heard before, and that's one of them. So what do you think with the rhetoric? Do you think what we're seeing is transitory, or what's your opinion on that?
That was one of those words I had. I keep up on this, and I do love doing research. And I said transitory inflation. I had to look that up. I was like, I don't think I've ever heard that term. It's like I got another term that popped up was cottage economics. I was like, what is cottage? Is that a new thing? I look it up, and hey, you don't have to be an economist to make up an economic term. We make up terms literally. We have something called shoe leather tax that you'll get people arguing over. That's just like walk into the bank, take some leather off your shoes. Like, so, hey, welcome. Everybody's welcome to make up a new economic term. That's fine. Eric has to spend a few more minutes Googling something. Transitory inflation I call it short-run inflation. I think most economists would call it short-run inflation. It's really a fascinating concept because you see it and you want to exploit it. But inflation is like gravity. It's just everywhere. It's hard to get around something that's just almost a law of economics at this point, is that there is inflation. But what it means to say somebody who's more concentrated on the finance side, I know I hyper focus on economics, and I apologize for that, but what we look at it on the finance side, it revolves around the thing that everybody in finance is chasing: return. And return is very simple. It's very, very simple. It's your real rate, how much you want to get, your interest rate in real dollars, plus expected inflation. It's called the Fisher equation. It's lowercase r plus pi superscript e. And that expected inflation is fascinating because it's not what inflation you see today. Nobody writes a note. Nobody buys a bond based on inflation anything today. You don't even buy things based on how much money you have. You buy in economics. We understand people buy based on how much money they think they're going to have in the future. We're always forward looking. We're an optimistic group. All right, we are the most optimistic apes to ever freaking walk the earth. I am a big believer in that. We just bounce from one tragedy to the next, and then we go to space. That's how we operate. So the question becomes, when does transitory inflation become normal inflation? And the answer is simple: time. Time is what it is. So right now, the U.S. Federal Reserve has a 2% target on inflation. And what that basically means is that if you're in the long run, if you're looking to buy a stock, you would say, okay, I'm expecting a 15% return. I would expect 15% a year return, nominal return on the stock. That means 2% should be inflation, 13% should be the real dollar on dollar return. Unfortunately, we are not seeing that in the bond market. I write fairly frequently for Seeking Alpha. I actually wrote an article about a month ago, 2 months ago maybe, showing that all the high quality market debt has compressed. So it's a binary market now. You either buy short term or long term, but 10, 20, 10, 30, 20, 10 are all priced at one number, and 5, 3, 1 are all priced at the same, which is awful because you think of it, 1 year debt pricing at the same as a 10-year debt.
Yeah.
As a 5-year debt is like, that's 5 times the duration. You should raise that interest rate to the 5th power. Nope, absolutely not, price the same. Which means people are unsure. They're just so unsure of what's happening. And I think once you start to see economic stability returning, which seems to be returning, that will tell us how much of this transitory inflation is real inflation. Like when I see that the year-over-year inflation was 5.3% and people freaking out, I'm like, relax. Here, tell me how it was different the last time there was a pandemic. And the response I get is, well, the last pandemic in 1918 was 9 years before macroeconomics was even founded. So we don't have data on it. We don't have data on it. Don't get nervous. If you don't know if it's going up or down, you get nervous, you get anxious to be anxious. So when transitory inflation becomes real long-run inflation, it's really based on how long it sticks around. Part of that is price stickiness. Part of that is everything we discussed with the stimulus previously. The more actions you see to remediate these economic volatilities, the lower you'll see this inflation fall. Yes, you're going to get some inflation that's caused by all this government spending. You just are. But it's important for us to remember that in the U.S., we don't do seniorage. So there isn't just a bunch of dollars getting printed with nothing to back them up. Every $1 in deficit is $1 in debt. So as long as that remains stable, the market will adjust the interest rate of treasury notes to adopt this. So the minute if the U.S. started practicing seniorage, which I believe is illegal in the United States, then you would start, this transitory inflation discussion would start to very quickly become a long run issue, like overnight. We'd be like, oh, everyone hit the brakes. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing we have seen is there have been a few more sticky, as you said, sort of sticky measures of inflation that we're seeing. So I guess wage increasing, which is good, but it is more sticky, and rental increases as well. We have seen that. So would you say the main thing is sort of watching those more sticky aspects and then seeing, okay, they've gone up. It's more likely that we might see maybe not, really high inflation, but some inflation.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things where you can't focus on every economic statistic because you'll go insane. Trust me. But those two exact two you just added, wage stickiness is a fascinating concept. It's amazing because wage is really the marginal production of labor times price level. So marginal production of labor is where the demand line and the supply line meet in labor markets. Simple as that. And it's the value of one additional worker. You take the value of one additional worker times by the price level is wage. So if workers get more productive, say by, adapting Zoom calls while you talk to somebody halfway around the world, or everybody getting used to sending emails instead of sitting in meetings for 4.5 hours. If that production climbs, that's going to climb wage, even if price stays flat. But if everybody's just as productive as they were before and price level starts rising, you'll see wages rise too. So if you know your wages are rising, you know there's some other phenomenon. Either people are getting more productive or price levels rising. And then you compare that to rent. You compare that to, say, how sticky land rents are. Well, you and I both know there's no production, there's no labor involved in a piece of land. Like a piece of land just sitting over there in the corner, there's not a bunch of people holding it up from underneath or something. So if you see both those rising, then you can say, ooh, is this a little bit of a price level? That's an exact way to look at it. Just take two factors. One you know is all labor. Wages are just all labor. And for the most part, some labor economist is going to call and yell at you saying what I just said is wrong. Broad stroke, kind of right. And you know land is just 100% capital. So if those things start going up together, you know that's probably inflationary. So yeah, exactly. If you look at those two, I think you'd be up to date on knowing if inflation is going to be around the corner.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one thing you mentioned there is obviously the employment and the wages increasing, and it's supply and demand and all that stuff. And we've seen in the US that there's been sort of a lot of demand for workers, but there hasn't been the supply specifically. We've seen it in the UK as well, where I think Brexit has sort of made it even more of a shock, because there's been less sort of a lot of the Eastern countries would normally come to the UK and maybe do a lot of those other jobs. So there's been that where we haven't seen them. So then it's there's a real sort of shock almost for a lot of these companies to actually get employees. Do you sort of see something similar in the US, or do you think maybe once unemployment, the added unemployment benefits stop, that it should be okay after that?
Yeah, so right now I was actually I provided some of this testimony to our local state Senate. And back about a year and a half ago, and I said, what concerns me is right now we have low-skill frictional unemployment. And like to break that down, to what that big economic jargon I just said is, obviously low-skill are jobs that don't require sophisticated capital investment and time investments to master or to be usable in a production better. I'm certainly not trying to insult anybody. That's just merely what it is. I pumped gas for like 8 years of my life because my family owns a gas station. It's not as much requirement to be educated as my current job as being a chief financial officer. It's simply math. Yeah. Frictional unemployment is the one employment that when you're taking your Econ 101 course at university, they go, yeah, don't worry about that one. Nobody talks about that one. Well, fortunately, we're talking about it. And frictional unemployment is when you choose not to work. You're in the labor force, you're available to work, but you choose not to work. And that has been almost exclusively reserved for people with very high skilled labor. Doctors, university professors, elite engineers in general. I think knowledge engineers are probably in that category. The problem with that is that we study frictional employment over the last 80, 90 years in economics in an environment where these people have very, very, very inelastic demand in very little supply. So the demand curve for them is almost perfectly straight. And the supply curve is very, very tiny. So you're talking about very, very high wages, very, very high marginal production of labor, in an environment where the supplier, the individual demanding the wage, is in a market where he can find multiple suitors. So it's a monopoly. They have a monopoly. They have an oligopoly, I guess you could call it. We've never studied that in low-skilled workers, where you can train somebody, and there's constantly this new inputs of people reaching, say, the age of 18 and can be trained to do these jobs. When somebody reaches 18 and they can legally work, or 15 and they can legally work with working papers, they can't go be a doctor. They can't go be a welder. They can't go be a master electrician. Those require time and investments. And the more time and investment something costs, it becomes pyramid shaped. You get towards the top, there's less and less people as you get towards the top. And my concern is that when you have elastically demanded positions, like a waitress or a dishwasher, whatever have you, each individual unit you have to supply drastically decreases the market wage and drastically decreases the level of production. If you need 10 waiters at a restaurant, the 11th waiter is completely useless to you. If you need 10 more, if you have 10 doctors in a practice, you add one more doctor, that's a lot more patients you can see. We we don't understand as economists low-scale frictional unemployment. And we're about to have the greatest social experiment in labor economic history, seeing how these people get reabsorbed into the market. Because what's going to happen is that if you're the first guy to show up day one when you don't get your $350 a week, you're going to be able to name your price. Here in Massachusetts, we have dishwashers who are getting 401ks, healthcare benefits, and almost $20 an hour, which God love them. If somebody's willing to pay you to do a job, you take that money. It's like when people complain about a soccer player getting, I can't believe they paid him $50 million. I'm sorry, would you turn down $50 million to play soccer? Why are we complaining about this? Fantastic. But the first person in the market, much like an oligopoly, the first guy in there, they have the advantage. So if you've been putting off coming back in the market and you're a low-skilled worker, don't expect to get the same treatment as the first guy coming to the market, because you're at different points on that demand curve. It's the unfortunate reality of economics. And I don't think there's a grand wizard somewhere making this up as they go along just to, hurt a low-income earner. But it is the situation we're in. It's demand curves. They're ruthless, and you can change them a little bit in the short run, but in the long run, it is what it is.
Yeah, definitely. And linking back to the UK, we saw that obviously, in 2004, sort of massive supply of people, obviously people wanted to, I think there was unlimited immigration, whereas a lot of the other countries had limited. So it was a great option. So they'd move over here and then there'd be a massive supply. So wages go down, but now it's almost the opposite. So I guess we'll have to see if, does anything change in that? Do we get it from other countries that, that potentially want to immigrate? Maybe Afghanistan, other countries. But yeah, I guess that's, as you said, it's a social experiment. We don't know what will happen. Will a lot of these people want to come back into the workforce? So we've seen lots of people retire early, potentially, and that's an issue as well. So, and I think that's what we've seen with the actual unemployment, that even though it's gone down quite a lot of people have actually left the workforce, haven't they?
Yeah, it's the labor force participation rate is declining. You brought up a great point about, that 2004, what happened in the UK is a great example of of a labor economic phenomenon that we see with immigration. And we had a similar thing happen in the U.S. in Miami in the 70s. There was a bunch of Cuban exiles who moved to Miami. And so economists studied that very closely. They were kind of curious what was going to happen. What we saw was that a very short run supply got wages fell just a little bit, and then skyrocketed income. And the reason is that when you have immigration, when people immigrate to a new economy, they bring their labor supply, but they also bring their demand.
Yeah.
And so if you have a group of immigrants who practice large scale remittance, so they're sending all their money back out of the country, it will affect wages negatively, but in the long run, but not as dramatic as you think. But if you see, we have immigrants who come in to immigrate to the United States, immigrate to England, to where have you, they bring their demand with them. And so they're creating higher wages for everybody in the economy. It's really hard to make an economic argument against immigration in the long run. In the short run, what happened in 2004 in England was fascinating. That's like one of the first things you learn when you start, getting into kind of your formal studies in labor economics. It was a great example you brought up, because it's like it is the example of like, let's figure out how this works. England, thank you for taking this one on the chin, because we don't know how it's going to end, but let's do this.
Yeah, it's crazy to think that's how it. But as you said, a lot of these things have never happened before, so that's how you have to do it, don't you? You have to, obviously, a lot of the times economists don't make the decision. It's politicians, and then from there they have to study the results of that. Yeah, definitely. So, sort of another thing we sort of talked about before about inflation or deflation, and we've seen that governments, they've basically used almost, I don't know if they have any other tools, but it seems like they've used a lot of the tools that they have over the past years to sort of fight deflation. If we did see a situation where the US economy or other economies, they're not growing as much, even though they're pumping all this money in, sort of what could they do? Are there any other tools that they have that they could use, or is there any other economic theories?
Yeah, it is difficult. I don't really think there's that many tools left in the tool chest. And I hate to say that, because I'm sure somebody like Powell, Yellen, probably know about a lot more tools than Eric. I'm go ahead and say that. I'm going to say it with complete confidence, actually. Well, I think one of the tools that hasn't been pulled out yet, and I think it's one of the best tools, is actually this pending infrastructure bill. I think heavy infrastructure investment just works. The average return on a road, on the interstate highway, is about 2% a year. Private industry will never invest in that, but the overall economic effect is fantastic. I think what you're going to see is a revival of with point-to-point travel becoming more common in airlines. I know obviously over in Europe, absolutely have mastered the idea of flying point-to-point with a plane effectively and cheaply and safely. I think you'll begin to see that in the United States. We're a spread out country, but Europe is also a very spread out continent, so it's a huge distance. I think you are going to see that. I think what you're going to also see is investments into lithium mining, into silicate minings. I do actually very much believe you're going to see this green energy revolution, because it's a good way to spend capital that gets your return. The thing with stimulus that we've seen with the CARES Act and ARPA is that it's good short-term adrenaline. It is. It absolutely is. But there isn't a non-human return to the element. It does bolster in the short run consumer confidence. Fantastic. But there's not a dollar-on-dollar return as you go down the road, no pun intended, that you get when you do highway, freightway. When you do, and we have a president in office right now who's been a huge supporter of rail systems, massive supporter of rail systems his entire life. I do think you'll see that type of investment, and that will spur economic growth over time. I'm also a big believer that as you see green energies evolve, you will see a movement, whether reluctantly or enthusiastically, to nuclear power. And the advancements you get out of nuclear power are insane. They're fantastic. I think especially with we have water crises, and nuclear power plants desalinate water on top of providing the best energy density. You could take 600 coal cars to produce the amount of electricity you and I are going to use in our lifetime, or one soda can of uranium. It's hard to beat that. It's just hard to beat that scale. But yeah, I think you'll see as a tool that will get pulled is long-term infrastructure. But I think it's going to be. I do think transportation will always be part of it. But I think energy investments will be very important in the long run.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess you said nuclear there. I know there's one, I think outside of London, there's a plant that's, 20 billion pounds or something. So, massive costs, and it takes a lot as well to a lot of people employed. And I guess that's what they're looking for as well, which is pretty crazy. So, Eric, thank you so much for joining the podcast today to talk to me.
Thank you for having me on, Anthony.
That's okay. No problem. I actually just have one more question. So, sort of what is one message or what from our interview that you'd like other people to sort of take away from it? What do you think?
It's a message I always love saying whenever I'm invited on a good podcast like this, which is, be engaged. Economics is common sense. It is absolutely common sense. And I feel the reason I do talks like this is because I really feel that we make economics out to be this wizard behind the curtain science. It's not. Anybody can learn it. Everybody's opinion on it is valid. And what it really takes is just being engaged, and it lets you cut through a lot of the political charades. Is having a good understanding of economics, so you can pick up a book. The one book I recommend, and I swear to people I don't get any royalties from it. A Wealth of Nations. Great book. The Ascent of Money by Niall Ferguson. Give it a read. It's one of those books I think every adult should read, where it goes, it really teaches you how these economic systems form. They make more informed voters, and that's really what the idea is. More informed, a better informed populace is a better populace, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. I think, sorry, I'll mention one more thing. You mentioned sort of, it can be quite complex, isn't it? There's so much jargon, and sometimes, you hear these words and you're like, oh, I can't even be bothered. But I think when you look under it, it is quite simple, isn't it? A lot of the time, especially the main concepts. And, if you know that, as you said, you can just understand things in terms of, it could be your own personal jobs and other things, or the actual economy in general.
Absolutely. It is. When I was very young, when I started the field, I had the phrase said to me, economics is common sense in a language that we don't know. start translating. So
that's a really good way to put it, I think. So Eric, if anyone wanted to get in contact with you or maybe send you a message, what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, I mean, you can always find me on LinkedIn. Love LinkedIn. I tend to answer my messages through there. I'm on Podmatch, and I also I have a little information page, the Ranting Economist. You can find me all through there, and I'm more than happy to. I always love answering questions, and Anthony, again, thank you so much for having me on. I do love the show. I'm not just saying that; it's a great product you put out there.
Oh, thank you so much. I do really appreciate it. Yeah, and thanks so much for joining the podcast.